Hi there, I'm Brother Merrill, and this is Sunshine for the Soul Inspirational Stories. As Pioneer Day approaches, I thought I would do a couple of stories about the pioneers. I'd like to personalize their experience a little more for all of us. After the saints had made their exodus from Nauvoo and Missouri, they gathered in winter quarters and moved into the Indian territories. They were on the land of the Omaha tribe. It had been arranged for them by Colonel Kane. It was considered part of the territories of the United States at the time. As they huddled there, they had very poor living conditions. Brigham Young lived in a sod house for a few months, and by spring, 2,500 saints had gathered in winter quarters. At that time, the United States government tested the Latter-day Saints' loyalty and asked them to allow 500 men from the church to participate in the Mexican-American War. So men began to volunteer for this. This took a substantial portion of the strong, capable men that were really needed for the trek west. They were opening a virtually uncharted course to the Great Basin, the Salt Lake Valley. As they prepared, Brigham Young took a group that he planned to have journey with him. James and Agnes Flake had been baptized along with their slave, Green Flake. They provided what they called a fine white mountain carriage and a team and tasked their slave, Green Flake, to drive for Brigham Young. And so much of the journey Brigham Young made in a light carriage, driven by a slave. There were two other black men on the trip that were also slaves. Along with 142 men, 3 women, and 2 children, they began to make the trek. They journeyed primarily up the Platte River until they got to central Wyoming. They went over the mountain range and through Immigration Canyon. The vanguard company included Orson Pratt, who developed an ingenious odometer system that allowed him to have accurate distance measurements as he charted a map so that saints in the future could follow their path. As the vanguard company was busy blazing the trail towards the Salt Lake Valley, the Mormon Battalion was formed and began the longest march in military history. One of the very first individuals to volunteer for the militia was Edward Bunker. He joined the militia, and about the time they were discharged from duty in Los Angeles, the Saints reached the Salt Lake Valley. Their position was really rather vague to the men in California. Some of them tried to journey straight east, and others made their way north, and he accompanied one of those groups and made his way to San Francisco. They were virtually destitute. Most of them had very little clothing and no food and no money. They were able to secure work in the Sacramento Valley, where they began work on Sutter's Mill. And Edward Bunker was there when they discovered gold, but he left and made his way to the Salt Lake Valley. He arrived in October on the 16th in 1847. He didn't pause long in the valley, just long enough to collect a few things. He was virtually destitute, and to make his way east, he left quite late in the season, and it was a devastatingly difficult trip. They faced conditions of starvation. They found a mule that had broken through the ice and been abandoned in the Platte River, and they ate that for several days. At one point, they had faced complete starvation, and they cut their saddles into strips and boiled them and made soup and chewed on the leather. So you think your last steak at Sizzler was tough. That's like a tough one to me. His group arrived in winter quarters on December 17th, 1847. Many of the wives of the battalioners had stayed in winter quarters, so he was happy to be reunited, but he was without funds, and so he went to Mosquito Creek, Missouri, and started to farm. And he farmed corn for 2 years until he was able to secure a wagon and a team and enough supplies to make his way to the Salt Lake Valley, where he arrived in 1849. He settled in the Ogden area and was there for 3 years. And in 1852, Edward Bunker was called to be a missionary in England. The work in Europe and England was going extremely well. The gathering of Israel was at a vigorous pace. Thousands were joining the church and migrating to Utah. But the leadership of the church was soon faced with a logistical issue. They had thousands of individuals that were leaving Liverpool and coming to New York and then trying to find a way to make their way to the Salt Lake Valley. The Vanguard Company had blazed the trail, and work parties had been dispatched to work on passages in the canyons and through the mountains so that buggies and wagons could pass through with much greater ease than the early saints encountered. But they were still faced with the problem of how to help all these poor individuals from Europe and England make their way to Utah. And they developed the Perpetual Immigration Fund in 1849. And by the time Edward Bunker was released with several other missionaries, they had begun to charter ships to bring saints over from England. Between 1840 and 1855, 22,000 Latter-day Saints migrated from Liverpool to New York, and these people were trying to make their way to Utah. And Brigham Young was faced with a logistical issue of how to get them here. And he had watched Indians traveling in the seasons, and they had a small conveyance which they drug behind their horses that they carried very lightweight provisions on, a tent, and people carried a lot of their own supplies. And I think this prompted an idea with Brigham Young of handcarts. His idea was met with a great deal of resistance. One person said that it was a cold-blooded policy, but Brigham Young really had no choice. He had to find a way to help these individuals get from the East Coast to the Salt Lake Valley. When Elder Bunker was released from England, the church had chartered 8 seaworthy ships to bring 4,326 saints from Liverpool to New York, and he was on board the caravan with 456 other people. The ship supplied the food, which consisted of beef and pork and beans and potatoes and rice, 3 quarts of water per person per day. They had deep bunks to accommodate the people. They had to bring their own bedding, and they were stacked in there like sardines. And when there were storms, the ship was completely closed up, and the container with the passengers was extremely overcrowded. And it resulted in a claustrophobic condition where people were just stacked in shelves, and the stench of seasickness and the chamber pots sloshing in the corner just became unreasonable. But Brother Bunker, this is what he said about the trip. There were about 500 immigrants, all saints and some returning elders on board ship, presided over by Daniel Tyler. The voyage was pleasant, with the exception of one storm during which one sailor was drowned. We landed in New York at Castle Gate, thence by rail to St. Louis, then by steamboat up the Mississippi River to Iowa, which place we reached in the month of June, 1856. Here the company was fitted with handcarts. I was given charge of a Welch company and left Iowa City June 28, 1856. We procured our provisions and teams to haul our supplies at Council Bluffs. There were 5 missionaries that were assigned to be captains of handcart groups. The first was E. Ellsworth, and his group of 266 people left on June 9th. D. MacArthur's group of 220 saints left on June 28th. And Edward Bunker's group left on June 28th, and he had 320 people with him. After they left, 2 famous groups, J. Willie's group left on July 15th, and he had 404 people. And E. Martin's group left on July 30th with 576 individuals. And next week I'll talk more about those two companies. Each company had a heavy wagon drawn by oxen and a lighter wagon that was driven by mules. The handcarts were pulled by the individuals, and a lot of the individuals weren't men, they were women and children. Each individual could take 17 pounds of personal belongings, and they carried 100 pounds of flour in the carts for their group. Edward Bunker was blessed to have two counselors who were both members of the vanguard group. David Grant was a tailor, and John MacDonald was a cabinet maker, and both of them had been on the trip with Brigham Young that originally went into the valley. Romance was no stranger to the younger single members as they traveled towards the valley. Eleanor Roberts and Elias Lewis were married in Iowa City, where they were given their own handcart, and they prepared for the trip. Eleanor must have been completely enamored because she had left her shoes on the east side of the Missouri River, and she walked the entire distance to the Salt Lake Valley barefoot. That would be like walking from St. George, Utah to Vancouver, British Columbia, barefoot. That's a distance of 1,300 miles. Kind of amazing. The company had to stop in Florence, Nebraska, because the handcarts had been built with green wood. It hadn't been allowed to dry, and so the wood shrunk as they traveled, and they had to rebuild a lot of the carts, especially the wheels. The heavy wagons were propelled by a team of oxen, and you had what was called a yeoman that walked alongside of the ox. He didn't steer the ox with reins, but he walked alongside with a whip. They called him a yeoman because if he said yo, the ox turned left, and if he said yah, the ox turned to the right. When I told my wife that, she goes, "You mean a dumb ox has learned left and right better than I have?" When we go skiing, I have to say, no, the other left, honey. So that's how the heavy wagons were pulled. One of the counselors for Edward Bunker was David Gates, and he wrote of the trip in a letter. He said, "It's been 1 month today since we left winter quarters. We are almost 500 miles from it. I have traveled the same road 3 times with horse and ox team, but never made the trip in so short a time before. We have averaged 20 miles a day for the past week and are determined to average that or more every day until we reach the great Salt Lake City. The saints are getting more and more of the Spirit of Zion upon them as they approach nearer to it. I will give my opinion. It is that the saints will cross the plains with handcarts for years to come because of the utility of the plan, considering the circumstances by which the saints are surrounded." As David Gates participated in this experiment, he felt by comparison that it was an excellent way to bring people across the plains. They made their journeys with the wagons and the handcarts. The wagons carried the main supplies of food, and they dispersed about 100 pounds of flour at the very most at any time to a group of handcarts. They also carried the tent for each group, and 20 people or 4 carts shared a tent. This is what else Brother Gates says about the trip. He said, "We have for the use of the company 18 cows that give milk, and have killed 3 fine buffalo, and eaten as we had need. Besides that, which I have enumerated, we have with us beef cattle, enough to last through to Utah, using one of them a week." So not only did they have to walk and do all the stuff you have to do while you're camping, some of them had to herd the cattle. And somebody had to milk the cows every night and every morning before they did everything else. And once a week, someone butchered a beef cow and prepared it for food. Then he says, "This is so healthy a company that our appetites are very good. There are some very old brothers and sisters that walk every day. One sister that has walked it all the way from Iowa City is 73 years old. There are in the company those still more advanced who ride in the wagons. Meanwhile, about 10 days in front of them was the MacArthur Handcart Company, and two sisters that were both in their 60s, Martha Bathgate and Elizabeth Parks, had walked every step of the journey, and when they were in western Wyoming, they had an experience. Mary Bathgate was out in front of the group with her friend and a bunch of the younger people of the Handcart Company, and she was bit by a rattlesnake on the calf of her leg. And one of the young girls ran back and told the brethren what was going on in the company, and they came up and they treated it the way they did back in those days. They cut out all around the bite and tried to push as much blood, what they considered bad blood, out. We know now not to do that. And then they consecrated her with oil and blessed her. And they told her that she needed to get in the wagon and ride, which is probably one of the things that saved her life, to keep her heart rate down. But she resisted that, and finally she said, okay, you guys are my witness. I have walked every step until they forced me to get in the wagon. They'd gone just a couple of miles when they stopped for water and rested for an hour and a half. And at the end of that time, Elizabella ran over towards the wagon to see how her friend Mary was doing. And just at the moment that she crossed in front of the wagon, the captain of the company called for the team to move forward, and the yeoman whipped the ox, and the wagon lunged forward, and the front wheels of the wagon ran right over Isabella's hips. Two of the brethren grabbed her and tried to pull her back, but the back heavy wheels of the wagon ran over her ankles. They thought all her bones were crushed, but they anointed her with oil and blessed her, and within a few days Isabella and Mary were again walking towards Salt Lake City. They were both women over 60 years old. Another perspective that I found very interesting was from Priscilla Evans, and she was pregnant. This is what she said. She described some of the camping duties and other things. She went through some real trials. The flour was self-rising, and we took water and baked a little cake. After the first weeks of travel, these little cakes were all we had to eat. And after months of traveling, we were put on half rations. And at one time, before help came, we were out of flour for 2 days. During this hard journey, I was expecting my first baby, and it was very hard to be content on so little food. My husband had lost a leg in his early childhood and walked on a wooden stump, which caused him a great deal of pain and discomfort. When his knee, which rested on a pad, became very sore, my husband was not able to walk any further. I could not pull him in the little cart, being so sick myself, so one late afternoon he felt he could not go on, and stopped to rest beside some tall sagebrush. I pleaded with him to try to walk further, that if he stayed there he would die, and I could not go on without him. The company did not miss us until they rested for the night, and when the names were checked, we were not among the company. A rider on a horse came back looking for us. When they saw the pitiful condition of my husband's knee, he was assigned to the commissary wagon and helped dispense the food for the rest of the journey. I hated to see him suffer, but it was with relish that I ate his little cake when he was too miserable to care for food. There were about a dozen in our tent. There were only 6 of us who did not speak Welsh, myself among them. There were in our tent a man with one leg, my husband, 2 blind, Tom Giles being one of them, a man with one arm gone, and a widow with 5 children. This gives you an idea of what condition some of the saints were in as they came towards the valley. Priscilla continues with some information that took place with Thomas Giles. She said the blind man mentioned above had a wife, a baby girl, and 2 boys. A remarkable incident occurred to Brother Giles during the trek. Not long after starting the trek, the baby became ill. After a short time, she died and was buried beside the trail. It wasn't long until his wife became ill and passed away, and was also buried beside the trail. Not far from Jim Bridger's fort, Giles himself became seriously ill. The company was held up for 2 days, waiting for either improvement in his condition or further deterioration. Finally, Captain Bunker determined the end was within hours, and ordered the group to move on, and left 2 men to bury Brother Giles when the end came. Fortunately for Brother Giles, one of the men wasn't Jim Bridger, because he abandoned Hugh Glass in a very similar situation when he was left to bury him after he passed, and instead he deserted him, and Hugh Glass lived. 2 men who stayed continued to offer prayers of faith and priesthood administration. Brother Giles remained alive until evening, when Parley P. Pratt happened to reach the site. He had known Brother Giles in Wells and was distressed to hear of all that had happened and to see Giles's condition. Elder Pratt pronounced a blessing on Brother Giles, promising that he would instantly be healed and made well. He would rejoin the company and arrive safely in Salt Lake Valley, and there rear a family. He further promised that because of Brother Giles' faithfulness, he would be permitted to live as long as he wanted. Every promise was fulfilled entirely. So these people encountered some huge problems as they came towards the valley. Edward Bunker summarizes the trip like this. The journey from the Missouri River to Salt Lake City was accomplished in 65 days. We were short of provisions all the way, and would have suffered for food had not supplies reached us from the valley. We arrived safely in Salt Lake City, October 2nd, 1856. B.H. Roberts reported their arrival and commented that they had arrived without serious adventure or mishap. I wonder if some of the other people would have maybe disagreed with that conclusion. Edward Bunker settled up in the Ogden area and became a bishop there and served for several years. He was later called to help settle Santa Clara down by St. George, but that area flooded frequently and it was a real trial. He served as a bishop there for 12 years, and after that time he moved with his family down to Bunkerville, named by Brigham Young. In 1901, Brother Bunker was called to help settle Colonia Morelos down in the northern part of Mexico. And he went down there. He was 79 years old. He died 6 months after his arrival. I look at the saints and what they went through to come to Zion, and I wonder how we would respond to such things. There was a great song, and we don't have songs like this on the radio anymore. Everything in the media is focused more towards pulling us down than building us up, but this song has some great lyrics. It says, "There is a dark and troubled side of life. There is a bright and sunny side too. Though we may meet with darkness and strife, the sunny side we also may view. Keep on the sunny side of life." So today, as we ponder all of the problems in the world and we hear the advertisements for all the antidepressants and the helplines for suicide and for all the other problems in the world, I sometimes wonder if we don't focus too much on the dark side and on the things that are wrong with our life. This life's not meant to be a luxury cruise. We are placed on this planet so that we could experience good and evil, so that we could learn to look to the Lord. So as you experience trials in your life, don't think of them as a judgment of the Lord, but think of them as a promotion, a way to grow and to become better in your personal strength, in your spirituality. If you're experiencing doubts about why you're going through things in this life, don't think the Lord doesn't love you. Because the reason you're having trials in life is so that you can become stronger and better. If you're wondering about these things, kneel down. Ask the Lord, do you love me? Why am I going through these things? Will you help me? And he may not solve the problems for you, but you will find that you have the internal fortitude to move forward and to do the things that you want to do. I hope you've enjoyed this story today. Please like and subscribe here. I appreciate all of you that are subscribing. If you like this story, you might also like this one. Or you can listen to all of Brother Merrill's stories here. Thank you.